Well, good evening and welcome to the final Ian Ramsey Centre Seminar for Hilary Term 2013. The title of tonight's talk is Judgments of Desire, a Thomistic Perspective on the Moral Emotions in Non-Human and Human Animals. Our speaker this evening, Professor Jean Porter, has taught at the University of Notre Dame since 1990, where she currently holds the John A. O'Brien Chair in Theological Ethics. Her research and teaching focus on scholastic moral thought, especially the moral theology of Thomas Aquinas, seen in relation to contemporary work on theories of action and intention, virtue ethics, and the philosophy of law. She's the author of 30 articles and 5 books, including most recently, Ministers of the Law, a natural law theory of legal authority. Her current project is a study in defense of Aquinas' account of justice as a virtue of the will. Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Jean Porter? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pensett. And I want to begin my remarks this evening simply by expressing my warm gratitude to you and also to Lydia Schumacher, who I understand is teaching in this college and is a fellow at Oriel, for helping to organize a series of most delightful and to me, very stimulating and fruitful events, culminating in these evening's remarks. I very much look forward to a chance to share some observations with you on a subject that is clearly of great intrinsic interest, that is to say, the whole question of the comparisons between animal and non-human animal and human behaviors, reactions, actions, motivations, a field of research which is blossoming in all kinds of ways, but which nonetheless raises what are in some ways some very old problems, and problems that we can still fruitfully address today. And so I thank you all for your presence, and I look forward to a good conversation. And so I begin my talk. While we have a great deal in common with non-human animals, we might have thought that morality, at least, is a distinctively human phenomenon. However, a growing body of research into animal behavior suggests that this particular contrast is at best oversimplified, or perhaps even mistaken. Apparently, many kinds of animals are capable of empathy, gratitude, and indignation over unfair treatment. These moral emotions, as they are called, are expressed through a range of familiar behaviors, behaviors we would recognize in ourselves, including offering comfort to those in distress, engaging in reciprocal favors such as grooming or sharing food, refusing to participate in uneven exchanges, or even retaliating for what seems like disadvantageous treatment. All these kinds of behaviors certainly look a lot like moral conduct, albeit perhaps in simplified forms, and they have naturally raised the question whether non-human animals are capable of morality in some full and authentic sense. Now, of course, it can be difficult to interpret the behaviors of non-human animals, but it does seem fairly clear that social animals of all kinds share at least some moral emotions with us and behave accordingly. The question is whether these kinds of sensibilities and behaviors should count as morality. According to the distinguished primatologist Franz de Waal, there is at the very least an essential continuity between the relevant responses of human and non-human morality. On his view, human moral behavior is considerably more elaborate than that of any non-human animal, but it is continuous with non-human behavior. Given this continuity of good nature, there is no need to imagine morality being mysteriously added to an immoral core. I think, although I'm not a specialist in this field by any means, my own sense is that most scientists and philosophers today who do work in this area would agree that non-humans and humans share a great deal, including basic moral emotions and their corresponding activities. Nonetheless, sharing this basic assumption about, so to say, what the facts are, not everyone does agree that non-human social behaviors and human morality should be regarded as 2 points on a continuum. There are some key elements of human morality that apparently are not found among non-humans. So far as we can determine, the moral emotions and their corresponding behaviors appear to be elicited only by those within an animal's immediate circle. That is to say, they don't do what we call universalizing. They don't extend responses to other co-specifics outside their immediate social grouping. Similarly, they don't show any signs of having a general notion of obligation that would in some way incorporate the more particular kinds of responses into one generalized pattern of action. They don't, for example, seem to bring together comforting behaviors and retaliatory behaviors under some one broad general rubric, but engage in each in a kind of very focused context by context way. Again, there seems to be very little disagreement that these discontinuities are there. The question is, are they essential? That is to say, does their presence in humans reflect a distinctively new element in human morality? I think it's apparent that this debate, even though it's occasioned by contemporary scientific research, continues a much older debate, a much older debate over the place of reason in morality. De Waal claims that there are no essential differences between human morality and non-human moral emotions and their corresponding behaviors, in part because he believes that human morality is fundamentally grounded in emotional responses rather than rational deliberation. And to quote, morality involves strong convictions. These convictions don't, or rather can't, come about through a cool rationality. They require caring about others and powerful gut feelings about right and wrong. Thus, de Waal's judgments about the essential continuity of human and non-human moral responses don't derive simply from the evidence of what animals do. They respect an interpretative perspective on that evidence, which he brings to it, a certain view about the place of reason in morality. By the same token, those who insist that there are essential discontinuities here aren't claiming to discover something that de Waal and company have missed. What they're saying, rather, is that those elements of morality which do seem to presuppose rationality, particularly the capacity to think in abstract concepts, to generalize, and to make judgments on the basis of inferential reasoning, that these are in some way essential to what it is to be a moral agent. And so they too bring their own sort of perspectives to what, as far as I can tell, is essential agreement on the, if you will, the facts on the ground. Now, as you might have gathered by now, or at least as you would guess, knowing that I consider myself to be an Aquinas scholar, I tend to side with those who construe morality as being fundamentally rational. And therefore, I agree with those who think there is a discontinuity here, that morality, properly so called, is a distinctively human phenomenon. Nonetheless, I also agree with de Waal that moral emotions such as empathy and indignation do play a central and indispensable role in human morality, analogous to, although not essentially similar to, the role they play in non-human responses and behaviors. De Waal is right to remind us that we are animals ourselves and resemble other animals in many ways, including many of the fundamental processes and operations of our sentient lives. He challenges those who would nonetheless emphasize the discontinuities between human morality and non-human behaviors to do so in such a way as to do justice to the real continuities between ourselves and our fellow participants in the animal world. And I think we should all welcome this challenge and think about it together, because what it really represents is an invitation to think more carefully about rationality and its place in human life. In my remarks this evening, I want to address this challenge through an analysis of the moral emotions as passions, understood in accordance with the moral psychology developed by Thomas Aquinas. I realize that this may strike you initially as an unpromising approach. After all, Aquinas wrote a long time ago. And he wrote in a context in which we didn't know a great deal that we do know today about animal behavior and its similarities or otherwise with our own. Nonetheless, as I've indicated, this is really an old debate, and I think Aquinas does have some things to contribute, not so much at the level of empirical observation, but at the level of conceptualization. That he has a way of thinking about the passions and the relation of the passions to perception on the one hand and to rational formation on the other, which helps us to make some sense of both the continuities and the discontinuities that are observed, and to do so in such a way as to do justice to the affective and, if you will, the pre-rational elements of our own cognitive lives. I want to try to make this point in two stages. I want in the first stage to look at the passions themselves as Aquinas presents them, calling attention in particular to the continuities and the discontinuities between non-human animals and humans in this respect, and about the ways in which the necessity for and the processes of rational formation, which extend to perceptual judgments as well as to the passions, do make a difference in qualifying the way the passions work. In the second part of the paper, I want to say what I think this implies for our understanding of the moral emotions in both non-human animals and in ourselves. In an original, wildly ambitious third part of the paper, I was going to talk about what Aquinas thinks about our rational processes. Then I realized that this was wildly ambitious, and so I'll say a word or two about that at the end and content myself with that. So, I'll turn then to the first section of my paper, Passions and Dispositions, the Remote Principles of Morality. Let me begin by laying out some general parameters. Aquinas, following Aristotle, says that all living creatures operate through processes of responsive and active engagement with their environments in accordance with the species-specific dynamic principles of activity comprising the soul. In the higher animals, including ourselves, these processes are mediated through the animal's perceptions of its environment and driven, as it were, by the desires and aversions or the more complex affective responses emerging out of these perceptions. Aquinas refers to these desires in general terms as inclinations, which he identifies as proper acts of an appetite. Correlatively, the appetites, including the passions, are capacities through which a living creature is capable of desiring or detesting some perceived object and moving itself to act accordingly. As such, they play a central role in the overall operations of a sentient animal. You might almost say that without these capacities for desire and self-motion, you would not have sentient animals. That's what's characteristic of animal life, that we do this. Once elicited, an inclination initiates some kind of self-motion within the creature, through which it pursues, avoids, or resists some perceived desirable, noxious, or threatening object. More specifically, the passions are appetites of a distinctive kind, capacities to respond affectively to objects perceived through the senses, including remembered or imagined representations, as well as what's immediately in the sensate world. Because these inclinations stem from sense perceptions, they presuppose bodily changes of some kind, if only through the functioning of the sense organs themselves, and they are naturally targeted towards particular objects of desire and aversion. Let me say, by the way, just to keep track of the concepts here, I think it's probably more accurate to identify what we call the moral emotions, or the emotions generally, with what Aquinas would call the inclinations of passions or of other appetites. And so you have the basic capacity for feeling of a certain kind, and then you have what we experience as and refer to our feelings or our emotions, which would be the inclination of the passion. Small point, but I think worth keeping clear. In non-human animals, the passions operate spontaneously in such a way as to move the animal to act effectively in relation to its environment. A non-human animal perceives its environment in terms set by its natural needs and vulnerabilities, and it responds and acts accordingly. Usually these processes, coordinated by what Aquinas calls a kind of estimative sense, work together in such a way as to promote the animal's successful operation within its environment. This is just what we would expect, because living creatures of a given kind are naturally suited to a particular kind of environment, so much so that a species is defined in part by reference to its typical surroundings. The animal's engagement with its environment is thus determined by its overall desires and aversions, in such a way that it sees the world in terms of what is good or bad for an animal of its kind. At the same time, it's important to keep in mind that these perceptions and desires are grounded in a veridical grasp of the world as it is, by which I mean, of course, not a perceptual grasp that is infallible, but a capacity for perceiving the world in ways which do generally track what's really out there. The sheep comes into the beautiful green meadow and responds, translating this liberally, "Yum, dinner." Well, you know, I mean, the sheep isn't perhaps thinking at any sort of broad conceptual level, but the sheep gets what it needs to get, which is that that green meadow is good. And if it sees the wolf, it responds in terms of, "I'm out of here," and again, that's veridical. That's what a sheep ought to really do in this circumstance. If the passions and the perceptions that they track were not veridical and sound in this way, the animal would not belong for this world, and neither would the kind that it represents. So we would say the animal's perceptions are narrowly focused, perhaps, but they are sound and adequate for its purposes, at least normally so. Like the other higher animals, human beings are tethered to their immediate environment through sensory perceptions, leading to spontaneous inclinations of desire or aversion grounded in the sensory appetites, that is to say, the passions. Human beings, like other animals, are tethered to their environment in this way, and human passions are fundamentally similar in many ways to the passions of non-human animals. That is to say, they follow on immediate perceptions, they're expressed through inclinations, which are usually felt in some way, and they respond most immediately and directly to particulars. Nonetheless, there are also key differences here, and this is where the analysis gets interesting. That is to say, perceptions and feelings are not innately tied to particular objects in the ways that the passions of non-human animals are. This indeterminacy of reference, if you will, is by no means a defect in itself. Rather, it gives our perceptions and feelings a kind of plasticity, which enables them to be shaped by rational formation and reflection. The squirrels in our backyard naturally perceive our garden as a kind of salad bar, and from their perspective, they're perfectly justified in doing so. But by the same token, they cannot see these bulbs and plants in any other way, as an ensemble of living creatures in its own right, or a lovely pattern of colors and scents, or the remote cause of a particular danger, represented by my husband hovering in the background with whatever he thinks will bash the squirrels. He's not really a danger, by the way. The squirrels always win, but if you know squirrels, you know what I'm talking about. In contrast, even the sensory perceptions of a rational creature presuppose some degree of rational formation. Apparently, we have to literally learn how to see, how to hear, how to feel. That is to say, we have to learn to correlate our perceptions with meaningful images, so that we can do even very basic things like separating objects from a field of vision. By the same token, we can learn to perceive in more than one way, and to shape our perceptions in one direction rather than another. Now, the indeterminacy of human passions is the immediate consequence of the indeterminacy of perception. In themselves, our passions are capacities for characteristic kinds of affective responses. For example, the passion of love, the most basic of the passions, is a capacity to respond with desire and delight towards objects of a suitable kind. But for the human animal, unlike non-humans, this general capacity is not correlated to any particular object or even any generic kind of object. We must be taught to see the world rightly, both in relation to our own desires and limitations, and from other perspectives as well, including both intersubjective perspectives and those which are more or less detached from what we might call a human point of view. In the process, we are also inevitably being taught how to feel, what to desire, and what to reject or flee. Our perceptual capacities and our passions will necessarily be formed together because the passions are naturally correlated with certain kinds of perceptions. Once we learn that something is potentially edible, we will be disposed to respond to it with hunger and delight, thus bringing it within the broad field, the very broad field, of possible objects of love. Because we are tethered to our world through sensory perceptions and desires, each shapes the other in complex but intelligible ways, and they must be shaped together if either is to function properly. This, in my view, explains why Aquinas says that the passions of the human person must be shaped by habits, that is to say, stable dispositions orienting these habits towards determinate kinds of objects. Prior to formation, the passions yield nothing more than unfocused desires and aversions, which cannot elicit action. They can't perform their basic function of moving the animal to activity because they lack a determinate object. These capacities for responsive feeling need to be formed through ongoing processes of training and education so that they will be elicited and expressed in accordance with some appropriate definite objects or not. This presupposes an extended process of rational formation in which the agent is taught to perceive and to feel in accordance with some ensemble of reasons. These need not incidentally be good reasons. This process can yield either virtues or vices, but there has to be some kind of rational formation in play here if the passions are to be formed and operate at all. At the same time, it is important to realize that while human passions must be shaped in accordance with rational judgments in order to function, they always play an irreducible role in the overall operations of the human animal. Reason shapes the passions, but it does not replace them. And what is more, they retain a kind of independence insofar as they can elicit inclinations prior to and perhaps even contrary to one's rational judgments. This brings us to an important point. Aquinas would agree with De Waal that there is something kind of odd about assuming that we might think of a human being as having a moral capacity grafted onto a non-moral core. But for Aquinas, this image would miss the mark because for the rational creature, there is no aspect of conscious functioning, including sensory perceptions and desires, which is not qualified in some way by rational judgments and the desires that these elicit. A mature, functionally normal human being perceives, feels, and acts in accordance with a conceptual framework of some kind, without which he could not function properly at all, even at the most basic levels of perception and sensory desire. At the same time, these diverse qualities that go to make up the agent's rationality can only function effectively if they are integrated into his conscious functioning at the basic level of passions and inclinations. Rational thought always depends on the starting points generated by particular perceptions, and the agent's will and his powers of deliberation and choice would not be effectively engaged unless he were tethered to his environment through the ongoing dynamism of the inclinations of the passions, immediate perceptions, and mental images. Thus, De Waal is right to say that without emotions or the inclinations of the passions, the agent would not be moved to act at all. And furthermore, I think he's right, and I think Aquinas would have no stake in disagreeing, that the passions can operate in such a way as to elicit judgments and responses without prior deliberation. Sometimes we really do just see a situation in a certain way and respond appropriately. But that does not mean that the passions are ever operating prior to reason or apart from reason. They operate in the way they do in accordance with the rational considerations which shape them. And these in turn are expressed through and help to form what De Waal calls our gut feelings, our immediate intuitions. These rational considerations cannot be elicited from sensory perceptions alone. They require, in addition, rational principles, which Aquinas regards as foundational for moral reasoning. And this, of course, brings me to the second part of my talk, that is to say, the moral emotions, intersubjective passions, and the principles of obligation. The first point that needs to be made in order to extend Aquinas' general analysis of the passions to the moral emotions is simply that the moral emotions are themselves inclinations of passions. That is to say, they fit the same general template of the passions and their inclinations as do other more straightforward desires and aversions. That is to say, they operate through inclinations elicited by sensory perceptions of some kind, and they are directed towards a particular object. This may not be immediately apparent because the moral emotions are generally more complex than straightforward desires and aversions, and therefore we might think they are not tethered to specific veridical apprehensions in the same way. However, Aquinas' analysis certainly allows for more complex passions, which he identifies with the irascible, or it's sometimes called the spirited passions, involving both some apprehension of danger or unpleasantness and an active desire to resist or to ameliorate or to carry through some kind of aggressive or spirited activity. Anger is the classical example of this kind of passion, as is, to take another example, the passion of hope. Most, if not all, of the moral emotions seem to fit this general template, involving as they do both aversion from or attraction to a perceived state of affairs, and a desire to correct or perhaps to complete the situation through some kind of active confrontation or response. As for the perceptions that elicit the moral emotions, it is true that these are not tied to specific objects in the animal's environment, in the same way as most passions of desire and aversion are. Say we have a bonobo. I choose bonobos because they're nicer than chimps, apparently. The bonobo perceives a nice orange as a snack and just takes it, while she perceives a tiger as a threat and she runs from it. But say she perceives one of her fellows in evident distress, and she responds with apparent sorrow and a desire to give comfort. What is it she's perceiving, and how is she responding? It seems too quick that she simply perceives another bonobo, or even that she perceives a sad bonobo. Neither captures what it is about this perception that elicits the complex passion in combining distress at another's sorrow and a desire to comfort. If the bonobo were simply saddened by the perception of another's suffering, perhaps through a kind of emotional contagion, we would expect a response of avoidance or flight. What moves her to offer comfort instead? The moral emotions are so called because they prompt an animal to enter into some kind of relation to another. This presupposes a perception of the other in terms of its relation to the creature, that is to say, as an appropriate target for some kind of activity. The kindly bonobo does not just perceive her sorrowing fellow as another ape. She sees him as something eliciting comfort in some way. Thus, she perceives him in the terms set by her natural inclinations towards activities of a certain kind, just as she perceives an orange, among other things, as an appropriate target for the activities of grasping and eating. So far, we don't need to qualify Aquinas' overall account of the passions in order to account for the moral emotion of compassion as a complex passion prompting both sorrow and active engagement. We can account for the bonobo's behavior without assuming anything other than a straightforward apprehension of a particular object, mediated through images grounded in her immediate sensory perceptions. In this case, the object in question is not a physical entity, but an entity of a certain kind, a fellow creature, seen as related to her in a certain way, as an appropriate object of comfort. Now, let me at this point try to forestall a natural misunderstanding. I am not saying that the non-human animal perceives its fellows as such, that is to say, as distinct and independent entities, similar to and yet distinct from the individual herself. Nor do we need assume that the animal brings to mind, as it were, any considerations of the other's situation, any sense of how she would feel in its place, the appropriateness of one kind of response rather than another, or anything else like that. My point is rather that the non-human animal does not need to reflect in these terms at all, in order to relate to its fellows in appropriate ways. Its perceptions of others in its immediate social circle are perceptions of appropriate relations, mediated through images that bring together certain patterns of behavior on the part of another with one's responses. These relations and the responsive operations that they elicit are as much a part of the animal's immediate environment and its dynamic interactions with that environment as the ongoing array of edibles and threats, eliciting desire and consumption or fear and avoidance. The animal does not need to think about its fellows as such in order to respond appropriately to them, any more than it needs to think of an orange as a fruit or an edible fruit in order to eat it. This example brings us to the second issue mentioned above. The inclinations of a non-human animal to eat a nice piece of fruit or to flee a predator fit within the overall form of life appropriate to it, because generally fruit is edible and predators are dangerous. The animal's perceptions are narrowly focused on its needs and desires, but within these limits they are generally veridical. But can we say the same thing about its perceptions of the appropriate relations between itself and its fellows? We can best address this question by starting with the inclinations and operations in question, rather than the perceptions eliciting them. What are the moral emotions and their corresponding behaviors good for? That is to say, what place do they have in the overall operations and the form of life proper to living creatures of a certain kind? Certainly, consuming food and avoiding predators promote the survival of the individual, and mating promotes the ongoing existence of the species. But how do social behaviors fit into the overall form of life proper to a given kind of animal? Once we have posed the question in these terms, it really almost answers itself. That is, social animals are characterized by a form of life that is, well, social. One in which populations are held together through patterned interactions which both sustain the individual through its life course and promote the ongoing existence of the group. Life within a community held together through dynamic, structured relations is natural to certain kinds of animals, and they cannot flourish individually or collectively apart from these patterned interactions. By relating to one another in given ways, individuals sustain these patterned interactions. By participating in core relations of dominance, submission, and cooperation, reinforcing good behavior and communal cohesion through rewards, consoling behaviors and the like, and discouraging disruptive behavior through retaliation and similar behaviors. Correlatively, when an animal perceives the other in terms of its relation to that other, it is perceiving something that is really there, namely a kind of activity that fits with the way of life proper to this kind of creature, and which will, as such, serve to promote the overall functioning of the group. So far, the moral emotions fit within the parameters of Aquinas' general analysis. They are relatively complex passions, but they can be analyzed in terms of the desires elicited by certain kinds of sensory perceptions and images, moving the animals to act in appropriate ways. Non-human animals do not need to reflect on these perceptions or deliberate about them, because they are naturally disposed to perceive others of their circle in terms of their appropriate relations to others and to act accordingly. By the same token, the moral emotions of non-human animals are not mediated, or they need not be mediated, through general conceptions of altruism, respect, or obligation. A bonobo does not need to have a general grasp of what it means to be a bonobo just like me, or what it means to be obliged to respond to the suffering of others, in order to respond appropriately to her suffering mate here and now. A Thomistic approach to the moral emotions as passions, or the inclinations of passions, can thus account for both the similarities between human and non-human animals and the differences that remain. We too are social animals naturally suited to a way of life sustained through patterns of relationships with others. Like other kinds of social animals, we are initially drawn into these relations through moral emotions, that is to say, spontaneous responses to others which take the form of aiding, comforting, or perhaps withdrawing or retaliating. And I understand there's excellent evidence that we find these responses even in very, very young children. At the same time, the passions which lie at the root of these responses cannot operate properly without processes of formation, leading to the development of stable dispositions to respond in certain ways and to avoid others. This point calls for further attention, however, because the immoral emotions in us are not exactly parallel to simple desires and aversions for particular objects, and therefore call for a somewhat different kind of formation. As we recall, the desires and aversions of the rational creature are innately relatively indeterminate, just as her perceptions are. We need to be taught how to perceive and how to feel through processes of formation. To some extent, the moral emotions are similarly indeterminate, but less so, I think, than simple desires and aversions. They appear to be structured in such a way as to reflect some aspects of the perceived relations that elicit them, even prior to processes of training and formation. As Aquinas, here again following Aristotle, says of the passion of anger, this passion seems in a way to depend on a kind of reasoning, incorporating as it does a kind of judgment that some perceived slight or imbalance is not to be borne. If our moral emotions already encode this much, why did we need any kind of formation here at all? In us, the moral emotions may be relatively determinate, at least seen in contrast to other more basic passions. Nonetheless, we cannot effectively act on these passions until they have been shaped and integrated through the formation of stable dispositions, inclining us to respond to others in characteristic ways. Even these kinds of emotions are too indeterminate to lead to focused activities, at least much of the time. More importantly, we simply have too many of them, including contradictory inclinations towards the same person at the same time. And if you've never felt this, you are a very lucky man or woman indeed. Again, this problem does not arise for non-humans because for them the moral emotions spontaneously reflect the patterns of relationship appropriate to the group in question. But human perceptions of relations cannot function in this same way for us, in key part because we perceive and relate to other men and women, eliciting diverse and sometimes contrary inclinations. King David was angry with Absalom, considered as a rebel against his throne, and he wanted to kill him. Yet he also loved him desperately as his son and wanted to protect him. He could not act on both inclinations at once, and he stood in need of an overarching disposition, which would have allowed him to perceive and to respond to this individual in an appropriate way, all things considered. Spectacularly and tragically, he didn't have that needed disposition. But that, I think, just illustrates the point. In this respect, if no other, our capacities for moral emotions stand in need of some kind of formation in order to be amenable to integration and coordination. Yet, so long as we stay at the level of the passions, we cannot account for their formation as a kind of ensemble of responses. In themselves, the moral emotions do encode something real, namely, the responsiveness appropriate to particular situations here and now. But they cannot provide for a basis for coordination because they do not represent the kinds of general considerations that would enable us to place a range of responses into some context and to shape them accordingly. In order to do so, we need to move to another level of perception and desire, which will allow us some purchase on the diverse kinds of other related norms that inform the moral emotions themselves. We need, in other words, to introduce general principles of other regard and obligation, which will provide a framework for integrating and, where necessary, correcting our diverse responses to others. And we need to find some way of appealing to some general capacity for desire which does not depend on the responses to particulars, but which in some way is dependent on these general concepts themselves. This, of course, would be the will. Once again, it is helpful to compare non-human and human responses of the relevant kind. Non-humans do not appear to make use of general normative categories in their interactions with others, and there seems to be no reason why they should. They spontaneously see how they stand in relation to others, in accordance with internalized patterns of relationships sustaining the social unit in which they share. Men and women, in contrast, do not spontaneously perceive their fellows in terms of a pattern of relationships sustaining a collective way of life. We as individuals can perceive one another in more than one way, each of which elicits a whole range of responses and behaviors. What is more, the society itself is not going to be spontaneously organized in accordance with a species-specific way of life. Human societies must take account of the basic facts of our animal and social life, of course, but there are indefinitely many ways of doing so, which remain indeterminate prior to collective determinations concerning the proper forms of marriage and kinship, ownership and exchange, authority and power, and much more. This relative priority of rational determinations is logical rather than temporal, but it implies that the structuring systems of any given society are going to be contingent to some degree. For that reason, too, children cannot simply spontaneously grow into a way of life, grasped immediately through perceptions of others in relation to the self. They must be taught in general and categorical terms to understand their communal way of life and to identify their place in the web of relationships that it implies. Where do these general principles come from? Given the overall terms of Aquinas' analysis of the passions, they cannot stem from the passions themselves because these inclinations of desire, aversion, and responsiveness are intrinsically keyed to particular situations and objects. Certainly, the moral emotions are veridical in that they track an agent's place in a system of relations, which normally, if infallibly, reflect genuine aspects of a network of relationships. They point to the starting points for rational reflection, they elicit rational reflection, and just like sensory images in the sphere of the intellect, they remain necessary at every stage to ongoing moral deliberation and choice. And in this way, of course, de Waal is quite right, that we cannot function as moral agents unless our passions are continually engaged and at work. Nonetheless, in order to reflect effectively on these diverse and partial perceptions, we need to turn to general principles which stem from our capacities for abstract and categorical thought, and we need to shape our distinctively human capacity for desire, namely the capacity of the will and the capacity of free judgment that is itself a component of that, in order to respond accordingly. Thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much. We have at least half an hour for questions, maybe even a little bit longer if Professor Porter's not tired. I'm going to ask my colleague Inacio just come round. And if you'd like to wait until the microphone reaches you before asking your question. Thank you.
Thank you for your very clear conceptual exposition. You are referring to children, very small children. I studied children, or I studied shame for many years as a psychologist. And you can see children when they are 8 months, around that time, when they recognize strangers, then at that moment you can see shame. For example, when a baby wants to get too much milk from the mother, and the mother tries to temper the baby, you can see a sort of shame reaction. We are not sure that it is shame, because the baby can't tell us, but it's the same sort of behavior we see later on. Now, I'm not sure if there is any thought in the baby. Probably there is, but I think it's more, you can call it more a passion, and a moral passion indeed, already. But I think maybe it's the other way around, that those passions, these sort of passions and reactions and experiences shape the way of thinking of this baby and development. So I would say quite often that emotions, passions, And I think before shame there is anxiety, for example, and fear. Fear shapes something into shame. Shame is already some sort of emotion mixed with, well, social experience, with sort of thought, you could say. So I think it's more the other way around, in a certain sense, that passions, emotions, if they are the same, that's also a question, shape our thoughts very often.
Oh yes, I think so too, very much so. You know, Aquinas, and again here he's following Aristotle, makes a very great deal of the fact that we cannot think except out of a context of sensory perceptions, and the emphasis here is not on sensory but on perceptions of singulars. And that isn't just that we need these as the starting points. These ground us in reality in such a way that they provide the test and the touchstone for our abstract concepts. I don't grasp abstractly what it is to be a cat unless I know one when I see it, and that knowing when I see it is essential. I think it's the same way here. You know, we grasp what it is to be rightly related to others in and through grasping some underlying coherence and some broad commonalities among a whole range of appropriate perceptions of and responses to other people. And that remains the test of knowing whether we've got it right. I mean, I think that's very important in my own field, because there is nothing worse than a moralist with a big idea. Really, believe me, I've been one of these, and I mean, we're terrifying creatures when we get the bit between our teeth. It's critical that one's moral principles always be tethered to our spontaneous relational responses to others, and that we recognize what these are and can track what the principles mean in relation to these. Otherwise, we don't have principles.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me all right?
I can, yes.
Oh, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear thoughts of Aquinas as in the 21st century. It brings me thinking about the origins of our university here. I just wanted to check a sort of general idea that came from your talk. Would you understand as a human being rather in tension between the indeterminacy and being tethered to the environment?
Yes. I don't know exactly what you're packing into the environment. You know, you may be thinking, are you thinking about specifically what we would call environmental concerns, or are you talking about the manifold context in general?
Sort of the general.
Yeah. There are all kinds of ways of formulating this. In modern times, it's formulated in terms of a catchphrase that I think goes back to Kant, that thought is both bounded and free. And that in some ways it's test. There has to be some reason for confidence that your cognitions really are checked by something in the world out there. You know, otherwise you have no real confidence that you're thinking at all, and you can't think with any kind of integrity or any kind of engagement with the world. But at the same time, one of the hallmarks of rational thought, a lot of people have felt, is the capacity to move freely beyond your immediate perceptions, the boundedness, in such a way as to step back and to reflect from a number of different perspectives at once on what this means, how it might look different, how we would understand it causally. And so yes, there's a tension here, but I think the tension is essential to human rationality generally. There's a lady back in the corner and then someone up here. And yeah. I don't necessarily see everyone, so bear with me.
Thank you. You spoke about engaging our passion. Do you think, and also you say that to be a moral agent, we really have to be engaged, our passion have to be engaged. My question is, do you think that knowing that we live in this social framework and sometimes our perception can be in line, or maybe our vision are not always in line with a true objective reality, that we can perceive things which is not, maybe they are not really the reality of what we think. Do you think that we need constantly to be, our passion or our emotion need to be constantly educated and re-educated to be able to be more free to see, to be more ourselves?
Well, I certainly, let me say two things, and I hope this is responsive to your question because you're raising some very fundamental issues. Aquinas would say, and I think Aquinas is right, that the kind of rational formation of the passions in accordance with some set of overall principles has to take place in order for a human being to function as a human being at all. But that doesn't mean we're going to get it right. You know, you can mature into a reasonably adequate agent on quite wicked principles or limited or distorted principles. And so, yes, I think there is a need for an ongoing self-reflection and an ongoing formation of the passions. And, you know, there are hints of this in Aquinas, but I think someone like De Waal is very good at really bringing this to the fore. Precisely because the passions do remain tethered in our immediate responses to the other and remain capable of emotion that's, as it were, that's inconsistent with our overall principles and convictions, they can have a very salutary effect. You know, we always think of the unruly passions as a problem, but a little bit of inconsistency can be a really good thing. You know, many a person's soul has been saved by the fact that he or she just could not do something, could not treat a person in a certain way, even though every high principle in the person's body was demanding it. And so, you know, I think we have to learn to listen to what our passions encode, while at the same time educating our feelings in such a way as to respond more fully to our best ideals of who we are and what we could be. Now there were two or three. Okay, this lady and then Lydia, and well, actually I think you were next. Sorry, I'm not doing so good at this.
Whatever you decide.
All right, well since I saw your hand first you, then you, then you. I'm an old school teacher. What can I tell you?
Well, thank you very much indeed for an absolutely fascinating talk. My question goes back to the original question about moral emotions in humans and animals. I mean, the way I would look at it would be to see that when we talk about moral emotions, in a way we talk about two things, right? We talk about emotions that are there, and then we talk about morality, which is we might say, a way of speaking about certain emotions. And so in a way to talk about moral emotions presupposes a mental linguistic framework that, you know, without which we wouldn't even be able to articulate what we mean by that. So one of the things that really confuse me when people talk about morality and animals is that it seems to me that we apply, and perhaps in a way we cannot but apply, this kind of moral language that we normally use for ourselves and for other human beings to non-human beings around us. And of course, at a very elementary level, we do that all the time when we have a pet at home, or I don't know, watch an animal in a film and think, you know, this is cruel or it looks really angry. But of course, in a way, we know that at one level is really anthropomorphism. So I suppose my question is, do you see a way that we can actually ever get beyond that problem, that we find a way of talking about emotions or behavior of animals by using a kind of language that is not anthropomorphic, well, is not anthropomorphic, it's perhaps really too much to ask, but that doesn't in a way beg the question of, you know, whether we're not ultimately unable to say whether they may have some sort of science system within which it makes sense to speak of morality, but which we just have no way of understanding.
Well, that's a very good question indeed, and actually there are three separate issues there. And, let me try to say just an inadequate word about each. First of all, I've already laid my own cards on the table. I think that morality is a distinctively rational phenomenon. I don't think that necessarily implies it's linguistic, actually. I mean, I know this is a controversial point in itself, but I don't think rationality is necessarily in every form linguistic. But leaving that aside, I would agree at the end of the day that for conceptual and theoretical reasons, we should not regard the so-called moral emotions in animals, if that's what we want to call them, as morality. And I think the differences here really are philosophical. I mean, if you scratch De Waal, he thinks he's a Humean sentimentalist. He's not exactly that, but he's close enough. And, he just has a different view of what morality is, and therefore he interprets animal behavior differently. Well, that's one kind of debate. There's another debate about exactly what it is we're observing. And here, there is just a minefield. And I'm sure the gentleman who asked the first question would know far more than I do about this because, we have very similar problems in observational studies of very, very young children. So what do we know? Okay, we know that animals give physical and, where appropriate, facial cues that would look like feelings of certain kinds in us. We know they behave in ways that to us could only be understood in terms of, say, attempts to show reciprocity. Now, we may not know what's going on in the little critter's little mind, but it's already a great deal to know that they act in certain patterned ways which seem to reflect responses of, well, let's just say relational, responsive and appropriate kinds of behaviors. And I agree with De Waal and anyone else who says whatever we think is going on in the inner life, that is significant in itself. And it at least should press us to think about what this means. There have been all kinds of things written about anthropomorphism in animal studies, and people sort of doing backflips to avoid it. I think it's very hard because, being a Thomist, I'm disposed to think that there are very considerable continuities between animal consciousness and our own, and to trust what would be my spontaneous perceptions, that I can have some degree of insight and empathy into what an animal is feeling. I think I know how the squirrel feels when it one-ups my husband, okay? Probably much the same way I feel when never mind. I think that is at least not an unreasonable assumption. These are living creatures that share a great deal with us. We don't have direct access to anybody's mind, including the minds of people who really have them. And so I think a certain amount of common empathy is not inappropriate. But I agree, once you start, particularly when you project the full range of a human moral response, and assume that the animal is grieving the loss of the dead or something, I think myself that goes way beyond any evidence we have of what's actually going on. So I don't want to deny the problem, but I just want to flag that it's complex. And I think there are ways to deal with it if you do it thoughtfully. Now, I think the lady behind you, and then Lydia. If there's a red light, it's on.
Oh, don't worry.
Just do it.
Just do it.
Thank you very much for the lecture. What is the latest research on the age where children can distinguish between good and evil? I've watched a film about some experiments made in Yale University, and I noticed that, accordingly to the conclusion of that film, that happened much earlier than 1 year old. And I'm not sure what you know about this. And I have a little parenthesis. I think I have a little bit of problems with the definition Aquinas gives to some some words which he thinks denotes passion. For example, love. Love sometimes, in some Christian contexts, might signal beyond passion. I mean, the conqueror of passion. So I have a little bit, in my opinion, love shouldn't be on the list of passions, but that is optional. If we can comment on that or not, I'm not sure. But thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Aquinas is working with a standard list of passions. I have to say I don't have a problem with it. If that were all Aquinas said about the passions and correlative desires at the level of the will, I'd have a problem. But Aquinas does talk about love as the primary inclination of the will. And love in that sense is not a passion. And actually, I myself, I'm not going to, try to get into this at sort of the tedious length I might do, but being that kind of girl. But I myself think there's a certain richness in counterposing the passion of love and the inclination of love that's fundamental to the will in certain ways. But that wasn't really your main question. The short answer is I don't know, but I've downloaded my memory on this. I mean, there are all kinds of studies on what children perceive when. Again, I keep referring to you. The gentleman who works with moral psychology of very small children would know this. I think it's pretty generally known. My own go-to source is for this and a great deal else. One of my favorite and most helpful authors in this, a man named Tomasello, The Cultural Origins of Human Cognition. The general point he makes is that you get a whole range of what we would call moral responses, even in very, very small children. The turning point comes when children are able to recognize others as other and to engage with them in processes of shared attention. Not only do you know that mommy is something other than you, but mommy can be brought to look at what you're looking at, or mommy can be brought to share with you in a common project. And that seems to be the point at which you can start to think reflectively and in ways that lay foundations for moral discriminations. And I think that's about shared intentions, about 18 months? Okay, good enough for government work. Young, very young.
Well, the more we know, the earlier it is.
Yeah, it keeps going back.
The whole attachment, bonding, indeed, and in particular the human sort of attachment, is very, very important. And the interesting thing is, of course, it's vice versa. So, a child needs to develop trust.
Yes.
But it also enhances trust and recognition in the parent. That's something which even develops, particularly in women when they are pregnant, but also the fathers. So it's indeed, it's very important for psychologists to get all those conceptual, let's say, distinctions, because indeed we are inclined, often like animal researchers, to see only the empirical thing. And it is true, we need the, so to say, linguistic tools or whatever, rational tools to make those distinctions.
And that actually goes back in a funny way to this gentleman's question. And I won't carry on here. I know that there's at least one or two other questions, but that's what makes anthropomorphism on the one hand a danger, but on the other hand possibly illuminating. Because we have a natural capacity, and most of us a lot of practice, in projecting and empathizing with and eliciting responses from very small creatures who can't tell us what they're thinking. They just happen to be our children. And we take that to the non-human world, and it can be misleading, but it can also be in its own way a path to insight.
But it's true. You can see it, for example, we have films of that, of mothers who are not able to sympathize with their baby. So they literally can't hold their babies physically. So they fall down, for example, and that's And in research with, well, psychopaths, we see,
Yeah.
in a certain sense, the same sort of things. And they often have a history like this.
And if the passions can't be engaged at these very basic levels, the formation of the will not happen. Again, and that's a very critical point.
Yeah. Well,
Anyway, yeah, Lydia, I think, was next.
Well, I don't know if there are a lot of questions. I think you already answered my question, actually.
Are you
Oh,
sure? Go
sorry.
ahead. And then this
Well-
gentleman in the back will be next.
Okay, if we have time. I had
we
a sort
do.
of technical question, which was leading up to a question which you already answered, about how your account sort of maps on to Aquinas' terminology. And so in particular, the discussion of the natural appetite, the sense appetite, and the intellectual appetite. So my understanding is natural appetite is oriented towards, reproduction and obtaining food, sense appetite towards the external world, and intellectual appetite is, unique to humans, and it's the means through which we pursue our projects and personal development. So in animals, sense appetite or responses to the external world is orientated towards the fulfillment of the natural appetite, which is just reproduction and obtaining food. So I guess my question was, I think there's a way of drawing the line sort of too directly. You were painting this picture of the animal just entering into the field and kind of seeing that it has food, and you're trying to add a dimension of the way that animals experience community or something like that. So I guess my question is, intellectual appetite in humans orientates us towards the common good, and so we're already kind of having a sense of we order our natural and sense appetites towards the pursuit of the objects of the intellectual appetite in conversation with how this relates to other persons. Is what you're suggesting basically that there's this dimension also in the animal world, but it's not moral? You're not actually suggesting that there's some kind of reflection of intellectual appetite or intellect and will, and thus real, genuine morality in...
Yeah, let's take a step back.
Okay.
I probably spoke inaccurately on this. It is a little tricky to get it all right, but for Aquinas, every substance, that is to say, every creature that exists as a certain kind, has a natural appetite. Okay? Natural appetite does not presuppose sentience. This has a natural appetite. It is about to exercise it. Okay? That's a natural appetite. The sensate appetite is an appetite which follows on a perception of the environment. The difference between sentient and non-sentient creatures is that sentient creatures have sentient appetites. And the point isn't so much what's the object. There's no division here between the different things you want to do, like reproduce versus eat. The difference lies in the way in which the appetite moves you to motion. A non-sentient creature, it's just sort of moved in accordance with whatever it does. It's not really moving itself. The animal moves itself because the animal perceives something and that desire elicits emotion. The rational agent kicks it up to the next level because the rational agent is able to bring perceptions together into categorical judgments, which involve normative dimensions, and to desire and act accordingly. And so I guess what I want to say, and again, remember, this is more a conceptual argument and a kind of philosophical argument than an observational argument. You do get real perceptions of right relations in the animal kingdom. They're not being perceived as such, but that's what they perceive when they perform in what we would call moral ways. I don't want to call that morality, however, precisely because I do think, for a whole range of reasons, that morality as such needs to be mediated through desires elicited by general concepts. Keeping in mind, however, that the passions are always engaged in that process.
That was sort of my question, that sense appetite it's one thing to say that sense appetite in animals is ordered towards their functioning and sort of reproduction and nutrition, but in a sort of communal context. I would understand that as natural appetite, at least in non-human animals.
That's not the way Aquinas uses the term,
Okay.
though. I mean, for Aquinas...
Well, at least in terms of those functions. So it's one thing to say that sense appetite is ordered towards fulfilling those functions in a communal context for non-human animals, and it's another thing to say that their sense appetites are actually turned, in a sense, towards morality, sort of towards a higher order, like pre-human.
That is what I'm saying.
Oh, that is what you're saying.
No, I mean, I'm not saying they do it through a rational grasp, but that's what I'm saying the animal perceives. The animal perceives the other as standing in and eliciting a certain kind of patterned relational response. That's what's being perceived when the animal responds to what we call the moral emotions. Okay. I think... And then the lady up here. I think I'm getting everyone.
Thank you for your talk. I think you said that morality is based on rationality. Do you think that human speculative reason and acts of the will are in themselves autonomous entities, or are they based on, or can they be derived from an intentionality analysis of responses to situations, such as similar to, as you described, for the non-human behaviour in situations of showing comfort, but on a more complex level?
I think that what you have in the case of the formation of categorical moral concepts and the engagement of the will is analogous to what you have at the formation of speculative concepts. That is to say, the speculative intellect moves beyond and generalizes and categorizes based on apprehensions of particulars which it comes to understand in a particular way, essentially by tracking the causal interrelations of things. And that does involve introducing a level of intellectuation, if I can put it that way. Perception is misleading here. It implies a certain kind of conceptual grasp of reality that isn't just contained in the individual perceptions themselves, but at the same time it's meaningless unless it stems from and continues to be grounded in these. You see, I think in the same way, and then this touches, I think, on several of the questions people have asked, moral categories go beyond our immediate and spontaneous responses which would elicit a desire to comfort or a feeling of warm bonding or a feeling of indignation towards another. And they involve some ways of trying to hold together some overarching ways of thinking about what all of these track and what they mean. But they can't get off the ground unless we start with these very basic responses to each other. And they're only meaningful insofar as we can track what they mean in the context of particular relations as these are experienced and mediated through our feelings, desires, and aversions in relation to others. I think this lady was next. Terrible thing when you lecture, you have to keep pointing at people.
Thank you for an exceptional address tonight. My question relates to the concept of conscience, and where Aquinas would have placed this in relation to social and rational aspects in the human, and whether he saw this as a distinguishing factor between the human and the non-human.
Well, he would have done, but for a reason that I think to modern audiences is bound to be disappointing. Aquinas has a much thinner concept of conscience than we have today. For Aquinas, conscience is the judgment of the intellect following on what he calls synderesis, the first principles of practical reason. It's the act by which we apply these principles to judgment. And he talks about it in the context of asking whether you're bound to follow your best judgments about what reason principles involve, and the answer is yes. And are you excused from behaving badly if you follow what your reason's principles suggest? And the answer is no. That is not a happy thought, but leave that by the way. I mean, the point is that it is an act of reason judgment, so yes, it's distinct to animals. I think there's a broader question here, and forgive me if I extend what you said, but let me know if this doesn't track what you're thinking. When we talk about conscience, we tend to expand the idea in such a way as to bring in some notion of both self-critique and critique of the principles of the community in which we find ourselves. And there too, understood in that more expansive sense, I think there's no doubt that conscience presupposes capacities for reason judgment. And you might almost say that's one of the things that reason judgment is good for. That's one of the things we can do precisely as rational agents that other kinds of living sentient creatures cannot. We can step back and test and evaluate our responses in the light of principles. By the same token, and this came up I think with the first or second question, the movements of the passions over against our conscience can also tell us something important. And so here again, it's important not to make the lines of judgment and the processes of thought go in one direction only. A passionate response that something just is wrong in and of itself isn't going to generate the kind of systematic critique that we need, but it can be a starting point for a change of thought and a change of behavior.
I have a final question.
Yes.
If no one else has got anything else.
You get the final question. You're the host. After the final no, there comes a yes.
Okay. So, as I said, I echo those compliments. Thank you very much for that talk. I'm curious about a slightly grey case. What about is it possible for us to give a moral imprint to animals? Now, clearly we can, by taming an animal, change its natural dispositions and its behaviours. And furthermore, there are interesting stories, for example, of holy dogs. So you've got a dog who belongs to some saint, and somehow the dog takes on some of the characteristics of its master or mistress. On the other hand, there are also stories, quite horrific stories, of dogs of the owners of the dogs of the guards in concentration camps. Suddenly seem to be having a developing taste for atrocities. So, do you think there's a way in which perhaps animals are not moral in the sense in themselves, but can we give a moral imprint to animals? Thank you.
I have to say no. I really do. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. I think that there is something really profound and interesting going on here. But I can't see attributing moral accountability to a creature that is incapable of not just responding rationally. To me, that's not really the line, but responding with a certain kind of self-possession, placing itself, so to say, through some conscious deliberation in relation to a social world and the world of its fellows. And so I suppose what I would say is that the animal has a natural functioning in a form of life, which for many animals includes close cooperation with members of other species like our own. And as such, it is, you should pardon the old-fashioned way of putting it, apt to be taken up into what you might call the overall normative shape of the human communities and individuals surrounding it in ways that I think do make a difference, you know, that you even could say in some ways are better or worse for the animal itself. But I cannot bring that to the level of moral accountability. any more than I can see holding very small children morally accountable, even though I think we naturally and spontaneously find the dispositions of small children either praiseworthy and admirable in certain ways, or really, really awful. But in neither case do we hold them accountable in the same way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just before I conclude, I'd like to just advertise briefly our first seminar of next term, which will be on the 2nd of May, and Dr. Kelly Clark will be speaking with the provocative title of Is Atheism Normal? So 2nd of May, you may want to put it in your diaries. Would you like to join me then in thanking Professor Jean Porter?